Step into a world where history is darker than any nightmare, where the rustle of leaves in a southern forest hides more than animals. It hides screams, secrets, and the ghosts of the hunted. Long before horror stories were told around fires, there were real horrors lived by the forgotten. Tonight we open one of those chapters. A group of 5 men were sent into the forest to capture a runaway enslaved woman, and the order itself carried a weight thicker than the humid southern air that clung to their skin as they prepared to step beyond the last wooden fence of the plantation. The calloused hands of the overseer tightened around the whip at his side, his voice low, sharp, and venomous as he gave instructions, treating the pursuit not like a search for a human being, but a hunt for property. The men chosen were not strangers to this kind of task. Each carried a history of violence hidden beneath their belts, tied into the leather of their boots, buried under years of dominance gifted to them simply because the law of their land declared them superior. To them, this chase was a sport, another night they would brag about later over ale and firelight, describing fear as if it were entertainment rather than the lifeblood of a cornered woman fighting to breathe in a world that denied she had the right to exist. The forest they marched toward loomed like a wall of secrets. Tall pines stood like silent soldiers guarding an older truth the men were too proud to understand. They believed the night itself would bend to their will. They believed 5 men with rifles, lanterns, dogs, and entitlement could not be defeated by a single woman who had lived her life under lashes and orders. As they stepped beneath the first canopy of leaves, the dogs growled, noses low to the ground, following the scent of sweat and fear left behind hours earlier. Their boots pressed into soft earth, each step marking their confidence, every breath a reminder of how certain they were that capture was inevitable. None of them paused to imagine the story from the other side. They did not consider the quiet resolve that filled her chest as she fled in silence, heart pounding, lungs burning, refusing to die on someone else's timeline. The men saw her as a runaway, a body missing from labor, a problem to be retrieved. They never questioned what pain carved her determination, what memories fueled her decision to run toward a wilderness full of unknown dangers, rather than remain another day beneath the roof where her screams were swallowed by night. These men followed her tracks, unaware that fear was not hers alone. Hidden beneath their arrogance, a quiet anxiety stirred. Some of them had heard whispers passed among enslaved people, rumors about spirits in the forest, stories about ancestors who walked through trees and punished those who hunted souls that never belonged to them. But fear was not allowed to have a voice among them. Pride drowned it. They carried rifles as if steel could protect them from things older than metal. They carried lanterns as if flame could illuminate every shadow. Their leader, a thick-handed man who believed God himself placed power in his palms, spat into the dirt and muttered that no woman, especially one he believed beneath him, could outsmart 5 armed men. His arrogance filled the space like smoke choking the air. The others fell into step beside him, their breath sinking, matching the slow, methodical rhythm of a predator approaching prey. Their pursuit was not only a mission but a ritual soaked in history. Their fathers had done the same, and their fathers before them, each generation passing down the belief that control was their birthright. They had chased many before her, and they saw each capture as proof that no one could escape chains forever. To them, capture was inevitable. But there was something different about the way the wind carried her scent, something unsettling in the stillness of the branches above. The forest did not move normally that night. Leaves hung suspended, heavy, unwilling to rustle, as though nature itself watched them intrude with silent fury. As they advanced deeper, darkness swallowed them like an ocean pulling sailors under. The first hour of walking was filled with muttered curses, dogs tugging against ropes, and boots thudding against damp soil. They spoke of how quickly they would drag her back, how she would beg, how they would teach her a lesson. Their language was venom, their thoughts blades sharpened by years of cruelty. None of them imagined that the forest could listen. None of them considered that the woman they hunted had learned how to move silently between trees long before they ever stepped foot into these woods. Though they didn't know her name, each step they took carried the weight of her story. A life that had known chains since birth, a voice never allowed to speak freely, hands forced into work before childhood could finish shaping her bones. She ran because she burned for something they could never understand. Not freedom alone, but dignity, air, space where no one could command her body or steal her breath. She ran because the woods were the only place she was not owned. Even if the trees hid dangers, even if the night held the unknown, it was still better than the certainty of waking one more morning in a world that refused to see her humanity. Still, the men never imagined she had a plan. In their minds, she was lost, terrified, stumbling blindly through roots and branches. They believed her tears watered the earth, and her blood was already promised to them. Their arrogance fogged their thoughts like smoke, and they walked on, unaware that every step forward led them deeper into a place where the rules of power no longer belonged to them. The forest accepted her. It rejected them. And the distance between hunter and hunted grew smaller, not because they were closing in, but because she was waiting for them to arrive where she wanted them to be, where their numbers and weapons would mean nothing, where the land itself bent to her will, where she would ensure that none of them would ever return, where the whispers of those before her would rise from the soil and guide her hand, where she stood watching from shadows as the 5 men who believed they owned the world unknowingly stepped into the beginning of their own unraveling. The woods themselves become a character, isolated, eerie, and unforgiving, a world older than any plantation, older than the scars on her back, older than the men who thought they were hunters. Long before feet pressed into its moss and soil, before axes carved trunks into planks that built the houses that enslaved her, this forest knew what it meant to swallow secrets and never return them. Its breathing came through the sway of branches that refused to bend tonight, its voice through the whisper of wind that suddenly stopped when the first boot crossed into its boundary. At the edge of the tree line, there was a shift, a subtle awareness, as if the woods woke up sensing what kind of men dared to enter its ribs of bark and bone. Lantern light flickered like frightened eyes against the trunks, but darkness was patient and thick, curling between roots, rising like smoke from the ground, waiting to reclaim what humans always tried to own. The trees grew close together, almost unnaturally, as though choosing to shield the sky from those beneath, giving no courtesy of moonlight. The men who stepped inside found the air heavier, humid, but unmoving, as if the forest purposely stole the breath from their lungs. Every surface felt alive. The bark on trees looked like skin stretched over muscle, the roots crawling across the ground like veins, the leaves overhead trembling as though they whispered warnings only she could understand. When she had run through these same trees earlier that night, they seemed to part for her, branches lifting ever so slightly, roots softening beneath her feet so she moved silently, quickly, like a shadow born from the very soil. The woods were not just a place she escaped into, they were her armor, her ally, her sanctuary. For men who had always held power, however, this place was something that resisted domination. Their presence felt unnatural here, like predators trespassing in a kingdom that obeyed a different ruler. The deeper they walked, the darker it became, until lantern light illuminated only their own fear reflected in sweat-beaded skin. The silence was not emptiness, it was tension, a pressing kind of quiet that seemed to lean against their bodies, forcing them to hear everything: breaths, heartbeat, the scrape of metal against leather, the anxious whine of dogs sensing something their masters could not name. The men expected the forest to echo with life, with owls or crickets or the flutter of wings, but instead the world gave them only their own footsteps, slow and hesitant, as if even sound feared being trapped here. Every now and then they thought they heard a twig snap somewhere far off, or the rustle of leaves in a pattern too deliberate to be wind. They turned their heads quickly, searching for movement, yet nothing was there. They whispered suspicions, trying to speak louder than their thoughts, but their words fell flat against a darkness that refused to carry them. The land itself shifted beneath them the further they went. Hills rose like sleeping beasts, streams reflected lantern light in ripples like watching eyes, and sudden hollows dipped low into pits where the ground felt cold, ancient, as if marked by bones buried long before their time. They walked around trees wider than 2 men combined, trunks scarred with claw-like marks no animal from these lands should have made. One of the men placed his hand against such a trunk, intending to mock the stories he had heard from enslaved people about spirits and ancestors living in wood. But he jerked back as if the bark were warm, as though it pulsed beneath his palm like a heartbeat. He said nothing, his pride too brittle to admit fear, yet from that moment on, he refused to walk at the front of the group. The dogs leading the hunt changed behavior too. At first they barked and pulled, eager to track, but soon their tails tucked low, their ears flattened, and they whimpered, refusing to move until pulled by rope. Animals know when nature itself rejects a presence. To them, this forest smelled wrong. Not like prey, but like warning. Their noses twitched toward places the men refused to look, toward shadows thick enough to feel, toward corners where even light was swallowed whole. The men believed themselves superior, unbreakable, ordained by law to be conquerors, yet their voices grew smaller the more the woods watched them. No one admitted aloud what they all slowly realized, that the line between hunter and hunted was blurring into something they could not control. Every step forward felt heavier, as if their boots sank deeper than expected, as if the forest tried to drag them down into its belly. The trunks of trees seemed to lean inward, narrowing the path, forcing the 5 men to walk shoulder to shoulder with the same ones they bullied, mocked and boasted beside just hours before. Now they were pressed close, each man's breath warm on the back of the next, because spreading out meant facing darkness alone, and none dared. They scanned the woods for the silhouette of a woman, expecting to see her crouched and trembling, but instead the only shapes they found were tall, unyielding guardians of nature that refused to break or bend. The woods felt personal, like it held memories of every footprint, every scream, every runaway who had ever touched its soil. It felt vengeful, as if it stored rage deep within its roots, waiting for a night like this to let it bloom. The enslaved woman who fled into its arms knew its paths, its streams, its hiding places. But more than that, she understood its silence. Silence was where her life had always existed, in quiet corners, in stolen moments of prayer, when no overseer watched, in tears sheed into soil that already tasted salt from many before her. Here, silence did not suffocate her the way it suffocated the men. Here, silence meant choice, breath, strategy. Here, she was not alone. She could feel the forest breathing with her, veins of water running like lifelines, shadows moving like cloaks ready to hide her. She could slip through gaps that did not exist a second earlier, step onto branches without breaking them, balance across moss-covered stones like a dancer guided by unseen hands. She knew the forest could become her voice. She knew it could become her weapon. The men believed nature had no loyalty, no intention, no will. They thought it was only background. But tonight the trees stood like witnesses, the streams like warnings, the shadows like shields. The woods swallowed sound, movement, confidence, and soon it would swallow them too, not with teeth or claws, but with patience older than blood and deeper than any chain forged by human hands. The enslaved woman uses the forest, fear, and survival instincts as weapons, though the men who hunted her never imagined she possessed anything more than exhaustion and desperation. In their world, she was supposed to be powerless, a body to command, a name never spoken, someone whose worth was measured only by what she could labor or endure. Yet the moment her bare feet touched the soil beneath the trees, she shed the role they forced upon her. The pain and trauma of her past did not weaken her, they sharpened her. Her scars became maps, her memories became armor, and every breath she took inside that forest was not in terror, but in calculation. She understood the land because her survival had always depended on sensing danger before anyone else. She learned to listen to footsteps long before they reached her door, to track moods by the sound of a whip being pulled from a wall, to anticipate violence by the shift in a master's breath. Those instincts followed her now, shaping her decisions with clarity sharper than any blade. She did not run blindly. She moved with intention, her body pressed close to trunks, her steps placed only on moss or soft patches of earth that would leave no trace. She knew how far sound traveled in the stillness of night. She knew that fear, when placed correctly, could suffocate a man faster than a noose. She first used silence. Silence was her shield, her cloak. While the men stumbled loudly through branches and underbrush, she moved like wind slipping between pine needles, like a whisper in a house where whispering was forbidden. She paused often, not because she was afraid, but because she listened. She let the darkness speak to her, let the tension in the air reveal where they stood, how close they were, how their fear was growing thicker with every minute. She watched them first before she acted. Hidden high within the branches of a twisted oak, she crouched, her back pressed against bark, eyes lowered to lanterns below. From that height, she saw the fragility of men who once held power. Their shoulders stiffened. Their rifles shook just slightly in their grip. They looked over their shoulders more often than ahead, She waited until she understood their rhythm. The leader always walked first, murmuring curses under his breath, trying to keep dominance stitched into every step. Two followed close, whispering to each other so quickly they almost forgot to breathe. One lagged, slower, uneasy, rubbing his arms as though chilled. And the fifth, the youngest, kept looking upward as though he sensed eyes watching him. She searched their bodies for weaknesses. Which hand held the weapon strongest? Which foot dragged? Which one would be the first to break? She began with sound. A single snap of a twig, thrown not by accident but by her fingers, landing far from where she crouched. The youngest jerked his head toward it, eyes widening. The dogs whimpered. The leader hissed for silence. She let the silence stretch long, let it hang heavy, let unease bloom like rot. Then another sound, a rustle, soft, distant. The men turned again. Sweat began to trickle down necks. Their minds, once certain and arrogant, now whispered doubts. The forest became her weapon because she understood that fear begins not in threat, but in imagination. She gave them imagination, fed it slowly, letting it coil around their throats. When she descended from the tree, she did not run. She slid down silently, feet hitting earth with the grace of someone who had climbed trees her entire life in stolen moments, when she hid from chores or danger, wishing to be somewhere the world could not reach her. Now those skills became daggers. She moved alongside the shadows, using them like pathways. The moon tried to pierce the forest, but leaves blocked its light, giving her the protection she needed. She placed stones on certain parts of the path, where she knew men would step, where weight would shift unexpectedly, where ankles could twist or knees could slam into roots. She learned to trap without wire or rope, using only nature and time. Fear was her next tool. She used their minds against them. The overseer used to tell stories at night, tales meant to frighten enslaved children into obedience, myths about spirits haunting the woods who punished runaways. They were meant to break hope, but instead those tales became her fuel. She let those old stories breathe again, let them walk among the trees. She whispered into the night just loud enough for the men to hear something that maybe sounded like a voice, maybe like a woman weeping, maybe like ancestors angry at being disturbed. She changed her voice, letting it tremble like leaves, stretch like wind, echo low like chant. The men stopped speaking altogether after that. Their eyes darted, their rifles lifted. They aimed not at a target but at shadows. She used her body as a weapon too, the strength she built through years of labor. She climbed, she crawled, she balanced, she waited. This patience was not new to her. She had learned patience the way one learns pain, with no choice. Waiting through hours of sun, waiting for permission to eat or speak, waiting while others decided her fate. Now she twisted patience into power. She did not hurry the night. She let fear deepen inside them, let exhaustion bleed into their bones, let doubt become poison. She knew that when a man is afraid long enough, he becomes careless, and carelessness is the first step toward losing control. She did not need weapons forged by men. She forged weapons from memory, from instinct, from the earth itself. She moved like someone who had already been hunted all her life, someone who understood survival not as theory, but as blood-deep instinct. While they searched for her, she had already begun choosing where each of them would fall, where fear would strike each heart, where the forest would swallow their bodies. She was not merely running, she was preparing. The woods obeyed her. Their fear fed her. She became the hunter they never believed she could be, and she waited for the moment to turn everything they once used against her, pain, silence, shadows, into the very tools that would end them. One by one, the men disappear, not by chance, but by design, and it begins so subtly that none of them recognize the pattern until the group is already fractured. The forest, thick and suffocating, seems to choose its moment, as though obeying her silent command. The men believed themselves predators, but predators do not move in tight clusters with trembling breath, clutching rifles like talismans. Their confidence, once loud and overflowing, had drained like water through cupped hands, leaving only fear in its place. When the first man vanished, it was so swift and quiet that for a moment the forest did not even acknowledge the absence. He was the youngest, the one whose eyes always flinched upward, sensing a presence he could not name. He lagged at the back of the group, rubbing his arms, whispering warnings that the others mocked. When the group paused near a fallen tree, he stepped aside to relieve himself, muttering that he would only be a second, only a second. But when he did not return, when his footsteps never rejoined the rhythm, when his breath did not merge back into theirs, the others finally noticed the silence behind them. They called his name once, twice, then stopped, unwilling to speak louder as though afraid the woods would hear. They aimed lanterns into the dark, but there was only a space where he once stood, ground flattened by his boots, and then nothing. No drag marks, no struggle, no sound. The forest swallowed him whole, leaving not even an echo. The second disappearance was different. Designed, crafted, intentional. She waited until they moved deeper, until their breathing grew ragged, until they forgot themselves in their nervousness. She placed herself above them again, perched like a shadow against a branch, studying how they clung too closely to their leader now, how the dogs refused to step forward, how the night tightened around their throats. When the second man stumbled over a root, cursing loudly, his anger made him blind to subtlety. He kicked the root, spat on the earth, and declared he would march ahead alone if the others were too weak. That arrogance led him forward, away from their shrinking circle of false security. He trudged several steps before realizing the lantern behind him no longer cast his shadow. He turned. The others were frozen in fear, unwilling to follow. His pride forced his voice louder, but before he could finish his sentence, a sharp crack sounded, a branch snapping under sudden force behind him. He turned too slowly. The forest did not give the others a clear view, but they heard his gasp, short and startled, like someone plunging into cold water. His lantern dropped, the glass shattering like fragile bone. Light died. When they raised their rifles and pointed toward the sound, it was already too late. He was gone. Not a scream, not a plea. Only the faint rustle of leaves settling back into place, as though they had simply consumed a weight and were content again. The third man tried to be brave, though his bravery was hollow. He muttered to himself about spirits not being real, about runaways being weak, about God being on his side, but his voice cracked mid-sentence. He walked faster, too fast, tripping, stumbling, trying to outrun fear that clung to his shoulders like a hand. When a whisper floated through the night, soft, feminine, familiar, he froze. It sounded like his mother calling his name, or perhaps a lover long dead. The whisper traveled between trees like smoke, slipping into his ears. He followed it, step by step, his mind unraveling. The others watched him leave the path, mesmerized, unable to call him back. His lantern moved in the dark like a floating ghost light, then suddenly vanished, as if swallowed by the earth itself. When they approached where he had been, the only sign of him was a single boot resting upright on the soil, untouched, as if his body had evaporated inside it. Fear now rooted inside the remaining two men like thorns. They no longer walked like hunters. They huddled like prey, backs touching, rifles shaking, breaths shallow. They questioned whether they were being stalked by a woman or by something older, something the trees whispered about when humans slept. But what they did not understand, what she knew, was that fear weakens judgment, and weakened judgment leads men exactly where they can be broken. The fourth man began to pray. His words were frantic, colliding with each other, begging for salvation from a God who never stepped into forests like these. While his eyes closed, she moved. She crawled low, her fingers brushing against leaves, calculating wind direction, using every past beating and insult as motivation, every memory of injustice sharpening the moment. When she struck, it was not born of rage, but of precision. A single movement, a rustle so brief it could have been imagined, then a hand around his ankles dragging him into a ditch so deep the dark itself seemed to seal shut over him. His scream bubbled in his throat but never escaped. The last remaining hunter did not move for a long time after that. He stood stiff, eyes wide, as though motion itself would summon whatever took the others. Now alone, the final man trembled. His breath fogged in the air, though the night was not cold. He spoke to himself, not to stay sane, but because silence now felt like death. He called out bargains into the dark, promises, apologies, pleas, each more desperate than the last. He offered wealth, offered mercy he had never shown, offered to let her live if he could leave. But the woods do not negotiate. She did not answer. She let him walk deeper, step after hesitant step, until he reached a clearing that seemed almost too still, too open, too expectant. There she stood, visible at last, no longer a shadow, but a figure shaped by defiance and fire. He raised his rifle, but his arms were weak, hands shaking so violently the metal nearly slipped. She did not run. She did not speak. She simply watched as fear hollowed him from the inside until the rifle clattered to the ground, until his knees hit the soil and the woods closed around him, welcoming its final offering, leaving nothing behind but silence thicker than before. The final twist reveals her past trauma and why she refused to let any of them return, a truth that lay buried beneath years of silence, hidden like a scar beneath cloth, unseen but always burning. To understand the fury that guided her through the night, one must travel back to the beginning, to the first moment when the world taught her that she was considered less than human. She was born into slavery, into a life where the first hands that ever held her were not gentle but calculating, examining whether her bones were strong, whether her small fingers could one day grip tools, whether her back would bend under weight. As a child, she learned to read pain before she learned to speak. Her mother, a figure who existed more as a whisper than a presence, worked the fields until her skin blistered, until her voice cracked from exhaustion. Often she would return to their cabin in the dark, her hands trembling as she cupped her daughter's face, whispering prayers in a language she had been punished for speaking. There were nights when her mother did not return at all, taken by overseers who demanded obedience through degradation. The first time the 5 men came into her life, she was only 11. They laughed while pointing at her, as if she were an object they were appraising at a market. One of them grabbed her by the arm and lifted her slightly, as though testing her weight. She remembered his fingers pressing into her bone, the smell of tobacco on his breath, the way his eyes did not look at her face but at her limbs, imagining their usefulness. That night, her mother held her tighter than usual, whispering that she must never let fear silence her soul, even if her mouth must remain quiet to survive. Weeks later, her mother was sold, dragged away screaming while the child watched, powerless. The last sound she ever heard from her mother was her name, torn apart by grief, swallowed by distance. After that, silence became her only inheritance. The woman grew in a world where punishment was not an exception, but routine. She learned how to keep her body still while the overseer's whip landed. She learned how to hide her tears behind lowered lashes, how to take blows in a way that spared her most vital bones. Her first escape attempt was at 15. She ran barefoot, blood spilling from the soles of her feet, believing that distance itself could save her. But those same 5 men hunted her then, as they did tonight. They dragged her back, tied her to a post in the center of the yard where everyone was forced to watch. The overseer whipped her until her vision blurred and darkness swallowed her. When she regained consciousness, she wished she had not. Her wounds festered, her body shook, and through the haze she saw them again, those 5 men, looking down at her as if she were a broken animal. One spat near her face and said she would never run again. She remembered that sentence as though it had been carved into her spine. Years passed, and she learned that survival required not only strength, but the ability to disappear. She became invisible by choice, moving silently, avoiding eyes, shrinking into corners when danger passed. But in her mind, she was sharpening herself. Every injustice became a thread in the web she would one day use to ensnare them. Every night she stayed awake, listening to their footsteps beyond thin walls she planned. Every whispered prayer became a promise. She would never be hunted again. The forest became her teacher long before she dared run a second time. When she was sent to gather kindling or berries, she memorized paths, watched where roots tangled like traps, where streams curved like escape routes. She traced trees with her fingers as though reading them. She learned that nature was not passive. It reacted, protected, shifted, waited. It became the only place where she felt she existed as more than property. She trusted it like she never trusted people. The trigger that finally forced her to flee again was not violence inflicted on her body, but violence inflicted on her hope. One night, she overheard talk of her being sold, sent to a plantation rumored to be worse, where women were worked until their wombs broke. and their names were forgotten entirely. That night, she stared at the sky, its stars barely visible beyond the cabin roof, and she thought of her mother. She wondered whether her mother died alone, or whether she found freedom in her final breath. She wondered what her mother would say if she saw her still living in chains, and she felt something ignite inside, something sharper than fear, deeper than anger. She knew then that she would run, but this time she would not be taken alive. When she fled into the woods, she carried not only desperation, but memory. Memory of hands grabbing her, memory of rope cutting her skin, memory of overseers declaring her life worthless, memory of the 5 men standing over her while she lay broken on the ground. She did not just run to escape, she ran to finish something. She ran to answer that moment she was told she would never run again. And when she heard them enter the woods behind her, when she heard their voices dripping with the same arrogance she remembered from childhood, she felt no fear. Instead, she felt clarity. These were not hunters chasing prey. These were ghosts from her past, walking into their graves. The forest stood behind her like a silent army, ready to shape itself around her vengeance. Every shadow was a memory, every breath a reminder. She hunted them because they had hunted her. She watched them break because they had once broken her. She let the woods consume them because the world that birthed them had consumed her mother. And when the final man fell to his knees, his weapon abandoned, his pride dissolved, she did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply looked at him, letting him see the truth he never cared to understand. She did not refuse their return out of cruelty. She refused because every scream she swallowed, every scar she carried, every night she spent wishing for a sliver of freedom demanded balance. The world took her childhood, her mother, her dignity. The woods gave her one thing in return, and she vowed no man who once claimed ownership of her life would ever again walk beneath the open sky.